So I would ask that everyone stays muted until we get to the Q&A. So that's after the presentations. If you wouldn't mind turning off your cameras, that's fine, to save some bandwidth. And otherwise, my name is Stephanie Arcusa. I am a postdoctoral researcher in the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions, and I will be leading this workshop today. So this is the kickoff event for the Intermountain West initiative, focusing on Arizona, the first of several engagement events to plan the road to carbon neutrality as a region. We recognize that many of you are already involved in such planning at various levels. We also recognize that many of you, this might be very new. But either way, we are delighted that you are participating, and we look forward to hearing about your ideas, your concerns, your needs, and your experiences concerning the changing face of energy in Arizona. So now I will ask again if Dr. Ditinsky is on the line. Okay, it doesn't seem like it. So I will give a brief introduction to the Intermountain West project. Can someone tell me if you can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect, great. So this is the agenda for today. And I will now present what the workshop will be about. Oh, let's see if I can change. Okay. So the Department of Energy, with the Los Alamos National Lab as a team lead and 10 additional universities, centers, and sovereign nations, have launched what is called the Iwest Initiative, or the Intermountain West Energy Sustainability Transition. The initiative encompasses 6 different states: Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, because of the shared geographical, environmental, and demographic attributes. Iwest has 2 overarching objectives. The first one is to develop a regional technology roadmap to transition the region's energy system to a carbon neutral and economically sustainable system. The second objective is to build a regional coalition that will facilitate the implementation and deployment of the roadmap within 15 years. The initiative is dubbed the Hub because it connects multiple states and leverages the unique properties of each state and community. Iwest is taking a place-based approach to identify regionally relevant technologies, but also to identify the unique challenges, needs, and opportunities and priorities of each community. The initiative is further trying to target carbon neutral technologies, especially those that can provide accelerated pathways to carbon neutrality as a region. For example, by looking at the symbiosis between carbon capture and storage, the production of carbon neutral hydrogen, and the production of bioenergy and bioproducts. Finally, the initiative targets a 15-year transition, and this workshop is the first of several outreach and engagement opportunities, especially here in Arizona, so that your community's needs, goals, concerns, and expectations can be heard, and you can help shape the plan. So I will now give a brief context so we can start our discussion. And I will start with the observation that climate change is already affecting Arizona. Temperatures have warmed by 2 degrees Fahrenheit on average over the last century. droughts have worsened, with the state average precipitation declining 10% in the last decade alone. And with higher temperatures and lower moisture, the frequency of large wildfires have increased, with the 10 largest wildfires occurring since 2002. And these are only a selection of the changes already occurring. It is worth noting that these are only average observations. So they mask the severity of the problem, because with changing averages, we also have changes in the occurrence of extreme events, which are much more difficult to plan for. In addition, extreme events can compound with social events, like drought-stricken communities having to flee and evacuate from wildfires while managing the risks of COVID-19. And of course, these impacts are not the same across different communities. These changes are caused by the increase in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, with the main gas being CO2, carbon dioxide. In Arizona, as you can see on the left pie chart, most of the CO2 comes from the generation of electric power, here shown in blue, mostly from burning coal and natural gas. The second biggest source is transportation, here shown in purple. If we look on the right, we can see historical trends. Emissions have increased from 1980 to 2006, after which they have held steady or even declined a bit, with about 90 million tons CO2 produced every year. All the while, the population of the state has continued to grow. I now would like to turn to the pre-workshop questionnaire. First, thanks to everyone who participated. And although this only represents a small subset of all of you here today, I wanted to share some notable results. First, all respondents thought that the impacts of climate change in Arizona would be major to catastrophic. And most respondents thought that the impacts on the economy would be negative. Furthermore, all respondents agreed that it matters where energy comes from, but not everyone agreed that access to an abundance of reliable and cheap energy raises standards of living. With that, I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Klaus Lagner, Director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. And Klaus, if you want to tell me when to turn to the next slide, I will change the slides for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll ask you when to get to the next slide. I have been asked not to talk so much about the equity issues which will be raised by all of this, but give you a feeling for where we will end up, how big the problems are going to be, and what we could do about it, and maybe turn some of the negative impacts into opportunities for our region. So with that, if you could go to the next slide, please. I think we can leave that for people who want to read later. I want to begin with that if you go back to Paris, people said we should stop at 1.5 degree warming. And maybe if that fails, we should stop at 2 degree warming. And these are centigrade. So we are talking nearly 4 degrees and at least 2 degrees Fahrenheit for the 1.5. So to give you a feeling how complicated that is, you can do some simple back of the envelope calculations and say the world is growing at roughly 2% annual energy consumption. The world grows roughly 3% in GDP every year. That's partially population, that's partially that people get richer. And so we are reducing the world's energy intensity by 1% a year. Now, some of this is carbon intensity reductions because most of our energy comes from fossil fuels. But if you really wanted to stop at 1.5 degree warming, which most people see somewhere around 450 ppm in the atmosphere as the limit we can go to. By the way, we are now approaching 420 parts per million, and we are going up 2.5 ppm a year. So we are a little more than a decade away from that day. If you wanted to do that, the carbon intensity would have to reduce every year by about 10%. The 9.6% here are actually for 2020. Since we already wasted a year, we are actually already past that point. This is my simple-minded back-of-the-envelope calculation based exactly on the numbers I give you right now. The red curve represents this. To see that I'm actually not wildly off the chart, here is the IPCC 1.5 C trajectories listed in the IPCC report, and you see that I'm actually relatively mild with that. On the other hand, a 10% annual reduction is equivalent to putting a country on a war footing. Maybe in World War II, the US did increase of production and changes at that rate, but most of the time you cannot do that. And by the way, the carbon intensity of the world has never changed by much more than 1% a year. So going for that 1.5 degrees is nearly impossible where we stand. 2 degrees, by the way, is right on its heels. Even in 2 degree, the IPCC reports end up having to rely on pulling back carbon at the end of the century to limit that overshoot. So what has changed in the last decade? We moved away from a world where we need to mitigate climate change. We need to stop doing what we are doing and not emit any more CO2. We now are living in an overshoot world where we actually have to pull back because we are higher than we are. So if Steve50.org wants to live up to its name at some point, which is saying we should have stopped at 350, we literally will have to pull right now on the order of 70 parts per million out of the air. And before we make that U-turn, we are probably talking more than 100 parts per million we will have to take back. We, in other words, need negative emissions or a big drawdown. And if you calculate how big that drawdown would be, that's 1,000 to 2,000 gigatons of CO2 we would have to take back. In other words, we will have decades, 40, 50 years of CO2 removal at a scale at which we currently emit. This is beyond any natural processes. This is beyond what we have ever done, but I will make the case that it is actually doable. Next slide, please. So can we stop at 450? I want to give you one more point. I just gave you that 9.6% if we had started in 2020. By 2025, we would have to reduce carbon intensity by 14% a year. By 2030, 31%, and then shortly thereafter, there's no more option because we literally ran out. We now rolled over the 450 and we literally have to come back. If we stay on the current growth path of 2% increase every year, which we have been on for the last 60 years, we'll end up somewhere at 900 parts per million by 2100, which would be absolutely catastrophic. So we will not go there. But on the other hand, we cannot leave the problem to our grandchildren. We have to start working on this now, and we have to work on it hard and fast because we are already 30 years too late in attacking this problem. Next slide, please. So in a way, I would argue we have a 40 gigaton per year problem. And there are three ways of looking at that. First of all, the world right now emits 40 gigatons of CO2 every year, 40 billion tons of CO2 every year from fossil fuel consumption. If we are trying to reduce those emissions, but keep growing in the world's energy consumption, and the developing countries will make sure that we do that, by the end of the century, that last 20%, which are incredibly hard to fix, will be again 40 gigatons a year because 2% a year growth for 80 years is multiplying things by 5. And so Arizona can play an important role in this accelerated energy transition for a variety of reasons. We have a very important role in solar energy. We can actually abandon fossil carbon in Arizona more than anybody else. We can become leaders in carbon mitigation, and we can improve efficiency. Our biggest asset here in the Southwest generally, and specifically also in Arizona, is that we have plenty of sunshine, which allows us to move over to solar energy, and we have open land, which is what you would need to install it at a large scale. in the end, and I will make that case here, we can obtain all of our energy from the sun. And with renewable energy, Arizona could become an exporter of synthetic fuel. Imagine that we take CO2 from the air and energy from photovoltaic panels and make hydrogen and CO2 into liquid fuels, which we can spread all over the country, and thereby become a center in the US's energy system. Next slide, please. So what are the options for Arizona? And I think solar energy is what provides our options. We, like everybody else, probably will end up to do significant electrification of homes and transportations with renewables. This is not all that easy, because keep in mind those solar panels run during the day and you would like to charge your car in the middle of the night, right? So we need to figure out how to balance those issues. I think we could be a big player in algae for fuels and bioproducts. We could use biomass for fuels and sequestration. How much we can do of that is not clear, but we certainly should push on all of that. We can make hydrogen for energy storage and chemical feedstock for electrically made fuels and raw materials, and we can capture CO2 from the air. Those are the new opportunities where we can actually turn the tide around and become carbon neutral, help the rest of the country become carbon neutral. And it would then deliver new industries for Arizona, right? Renewables and carbon capture are going to be big industries. I don't think we are all that big in carbon storage, because we don't have the storage capacity other countries also in the Iwest have. On the other hand, we and our neighbors to the east are the leaders in solar energy. So we probably be centered around making fuels, e-fuels, which are synthetic fuels, sustainable fuels. And we use those also for energy storage. Our advantage, as I said, is sunshine, open space, and a skilled workforce. And bringing all of that together may give us an opportunity to cushion the blow which this energy transition and the climate change impacts will undoubtedly have. Next slide, please. So our goal has to be carbon neutrality. How fast can we go? That's a big question. Keep in mind, we have to manage the societal impact. There are huge changes. Just think about what happened in the north of the state when the Navajo Generation Station just closed down. From an environmental perspective, it's great. From a human perspective, it pulled the rug out under many, many people, and we have to figure out how to manage those impacts. We will have technology impacts. We will do things very differently than before. And keep in mind, I live in Phoenix here. If we have 110 degrees for days on end and we don't have electricity because the new system didn't work as we planned, that would be catastrophic here, right? And we need to assure the stability of the transition, and we need to adapt to a changing environment. I think at this point, it is too late to say there are no impacts. We could have gotten there in 1980, but we haven't done it. So now we are forced to deal with the impacts as they come and manage the unavoidable damages in a way we can manage. This is not to say to throw up your arms and give up, because if we don't do anything, the damages keep getting larger and larger and larger. So the faster we act, the more we can limit the harm this will do. Next slide, please. So ASU here aims to get the carbon back. We need scalable technologies for the CO2 drawdown. And you have basically three options. You can remove CO2 from the air by growing biomass via photosynthesis. What's good about it, it is low cost, but it's limited in scale. If you scale that up to the 40 gigatons a year, you would need more area than the world uses currently for agriculture. The environmental footprint of this would large. Competition with food would be large. So we probably have to figure out how to get to begin there, but not believe that we can end there. We could pull CO2 out of ocean water, which is not something Arizona would do, but it could be done. But there, the concentration of CO2 is actually lower than in the air. 1 in 2,500 molecules in the air is a CO2. Carbonate bicarbonate in the ocean is 1 in 25,000. So I am betting, and we here at ASU are betting, that getting it from the air is better. With direct air capture, we can close the carbon cycle. We can actually take all the carbon, think of airplanes, all the jet fuel ends up as CO2 in the atmosphere. We can take it back out and make new jet fuel. We can deliver CO2 for large-scale sequestration, maybe not in Arizona, but certainly in Wyoming and Montana and in the Permian Basin. And we enable renewable energy to completely take over the energy infrastructure, because if we have too much some time of the day, we can convert it into hydrogen and ultimately liquid fuels, which then months later can be burned in order to have in the middle of the night in Boston on a wintry day, the energy and heat and the lights you need, and you can turn them on because you have that fuel available. Next slide, please. So our solution, we call it a mechanical tree. Here's a drawing. We are actually very close to having a prototype running on campus. It's being built right now. The mechanical trees are 1,000 times faster in collecting CO2 than normal natural planted trees. We are passive. The wind just blows through these things, and a dozen of those trees can remove 1 ton of CO2 per day, and you could package them up in a shipping container. So solar and wind farms can provide the energy to recycle the CO2 and water back to clean synthetic fuel. And if you were to gang up these trees with such a farm, the trees are much, much smaller than the solar farm. So if we think we can get all the energy from solar, which we certainly can, then the footprint we added by collecting the CO2 from the air is actually much smaller. Next slide. So what do we do with the captured CO2? In the short term, we consume CO2. We make beverages, we grow algae with it, we do agriculture, and there are a few million tons of CO2 going into this. Unfortunately, we emit a few billion by burning fuels. So the really big player is to make synthetic fuels from renewable energy and abandon oil and gas because we don't need it anymore. And then lastly, if we are 100 parts per million too high, then we, for decades, will have to take 40 gigatons of CO2 a year out of the atmosphere, which is what we are emitting right now, and put it down underground and dispose of it safely and permanently. And if we do all of that, we might find ourselves back below 400 ppm in a climate we can tolerate. Next slide, please. Can it be done? We don't know the answer, honestly. Right now, people have done it. In Europe, there's a company called Climeworks, which thinks they can do it at $500 a ton, which is prohibitively expensive. On the other hand, so was solar energy in the 1960s and 70s, and they kept going at it and worked at it, and they became over time 100 times cheaper. Those little red dots are the actual cost reductions in solar panels since the beginning. So every time they grew 1,000-fold, their price came down 10-fold. But direct air capture is tiny. It's kilotons right now. There are markets for megatons of CO2 right now. So we could enter these markets. And by the time we got into these markets, we are 1,000 times larger, and we should be, if this is a technology like any other, 10 times cheaper, which would make it affordable. And that is, I think, something we could pay for. $50 a ton of CO2 would be equivalent to paying about 40 cents on a gallon of gasolines, because that's the amount of CO2 which would go into making a gallon of gasoline. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll thank you for your attention. I summarized in brief outline what can and needs to be done. And it's a formidable challenge, and organizing this in a just and equitable way is not easy. But even if we don't make it just and equitable, it is going to hang over us, because climate change will not ask questions whether it's fair. It's going to hit us, and it's going to hit us hard.
Thanks very much, Klaus. And now we will hear from Chris Mays, Director for the Utility of the Future Center and the Just Energy Transition. And Chris, I'm about to give you remote access. Can you move?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so it's great to be here. I am Chris Mays. I am a professor of energy law and utility law and energy policy at ASU. I'm also a former Arizona Corporation Commissioner. So I had the great privilege of serving as one of Arizona's public utility commissioners here in our state for about 7.5 years back when the state of Arizona was enacting our energy policies. So I had the privilege of writing and implementing most of Arizona's current energy policies, and obviously keeping close track of what's being proposed and what's being enacted in most of the states around us. So we wanted to give a sort of a baseline assessment of the energy policies that are in place right now, and how they might change over the next 10 years. So most states, as you know, have some version of the commission that I served on. In Arizona, it's an elected statewide position. In New Mexico, it is also elected by districts, but in a lot of states like Colorado, Nevada, and California, and Utah, the PUC is appointed by the governor. And in those states, a lot of energy policy is passed by the legislature and governor and implemented by the PUC. In Arizona, by and large, energy policy is set by these 5 commissioners who are elected, as I mentioned. So this just gives you a sense of what PUC members do. They set just and reasonable rates for utilities. They, as I mentioned, they basically set energy policy for their states. So that's where a lot of energy policy comes out of, but also out of some of the legislatures and governors where there's authority there. This gives you a sense of where utilities sit in the state of Arizona, and New Mexico looks a little bit like this, but we have, about 15 utilities. The area colored, for instance, in turquoise is Arizona Public Service Company, APS, which is Arizona's largest utility. Tucson Electric Power Company is down there in the sort of violet color. So it's these utilities are in many of our western states pretty sprawling. Some utilities like SRP are much more urban and cover essentially only municipal areas. And then, of course, let's talk a little bit about the foundational policies in place right now that are supporting the development of renewables. We have the federal investment tax credit. That number is a little bit outdated. It has declined, although we're seeing some movements to increase it again. In Arizona, we have a very low renewable energy standard. The one that I wrote 15 years ago is still in place. I'm going to talk a little bit about efforts that are underway to advance that and increase that. You have PURPA, which is available for the development of renewables still. It's a federal law. Net metering in many states, or the value of solar export rate, which underpins and supports rooftop solar. And then importantly, I think going forward for the development of renewables from a policy standpoint will be organized markets. We have those in most of the country, but not all of the country. And we do not have a market in the Southwest. And there isn't, I think I want to underscore this point, and I think it can be important for your discussions going forward. There is talk behind the scenes and increasingly in front of the scenes about the development of a new energy market for the Southwest that would not be CAISO, but that would allow for energy products and energy services to bid into the market. The other thing from a policy standpoint that I think is going to be a huge driver for decarbonization and the development of renewables and clean energy is COVID recovery funds and the infrastructure bill that's being passed, and reconciliation. There is an enormous amount of money coming out of the federal government aimed at states and counties and municipalities related to COVID recovery that can be used and will be used for the development of clean energy. Just wanted to show you how far we've come. This is actually an old slide. almost every single one of the states in the West now, with the exception of Arizona, has moved to 100% clean energy requirements for their utilities. So Arizona, Nevada, California, Colorado, and New Mexico are all essentially at 100. Well, they have targeted 100%. Arizona has a rulemaking undergoing that what I'm going to talk about that would take us to 100% decarbonization in our electricity sector. This is the law that I wrote and implemented, Arizona's current renewable energy standard. And that's, again, very modest now by modern standards. It's 15% by 2025. Most of the utilities that, by way of context, have already essentially met that 15%. We also have energy efficiency standards in many states in the West in which the utilities are required to engage in energy efficiency, which is the cheapest form of electricity possible, the negawatt, essentially the electricity we don't produce by virtue of making our appliances and lighting and housing stock more efficient to begin with. And this gives you a sense of how profound it is. So the energy efficiency standard that I passed, that we passed at the Arizona Corporation Commission in the 2000s, will have saved and prevented the need for an additional 18 large power plants, because we lowered the overall load, electric load in the state of Arizona by that 22% by 2020. And so that's amazing. This standard alone, to give you a sense of the profound impact of energy efficiency, has saved Arizona ratepayers $1 billion. Policy that saved Arizonans $1 billion over the lifetime of that standard. And this gives you a sense of how much savings we get just from that 15% renewable energy standard in Arizona. 23 billion gallons of water will be saved. Just imagine, I'm going to talk about this, when we go to 100%. It also prevents 9,000 tons of sulfur dioxide and is going to save, if we went to 50% renewable energy, which I think we are, well, it saved Arizona ratepayers $4.1 billion in the form of lower rates, because renewable energy is now the cost resource. Also saves enormous amounts of water. If we went to 100% solar photovoltaics in Arizona, we would save, our utilities and the state would save 49 billion gallons of water every year. And in a drought and in the climate crisis we're facing, that is essential, largely because we are going to be shutting down the coal plants in our states, in both throughout the Southwest, as Klaus mentioned. So obviously we're seeing the proliferation of renewable energy projects, including at ASU. These are all projects at ASU, which has more solar on our campuses than any other university on the planet. That's Solana, a plant near Gila Bend. This is the Frito-Lay project. We're making sun chips with the sun now at Frito-Lay. This is a warehouse in Cottonwood that now has no utility bills because of its solar project. We're also, I want to mention this as well, looking at our commission and the commission and commissions actually throughout the Southwest are looking at electric vehicle policy. We have a roadmap in Arizona that the Corporation Commission recently adopted that shows that we need to reduce range anxiety among Arizonans for EVs. The commission also adopted a pilot rate to encourage off-peak charging, and that the utilities need to do more education and outreach on that. SRP's sustainability goals call for 500,000 EVs on the roads over the coming decades. I think the other driver for policy in this area and for what we're going to be talking about today is the enormous increase in emissions that our states are seeing. Look at this. This shows that most of the metro areas, major metro areas in the West, are under incredible duress when it comes to increased emissions. The Phoenix area alone saw 291% total emissions increase since 1990, and at 86% per person emissions increase since 1990 in Phoenix. And this is something that I think we have to seriously worry about. Arizona, most of the valley is now under threat of I think basically are in non-attainment under EPA standards for air quality. So again, as I mentioned, Western states are headed to 100% clean energy. The commission has cast one vote in favor of new rules. So this would update the one I passed in the 2000s and take us to 100% decarbonized energy by 2072. Not a lot of people love that date. They think it's too late, but it does have interim targets that are very good, including 50% decarbonized electricity by 2032. So that's what utilities would have to meet. The utilities themselves have already set goals, and these are not requirements or mandates on them, but goals for themselves. And so you can see, for instance, APS's goal is 45% renewables by 2035, 100% carbon free by 2050. That target is actually more aggressive than even the rule that the Corporation Commission is contemplating. Now, this shows a little bit more graphically what Klaus was talking about in terms of the coal plants in the West. Coal plants are now uneconomic. This is not about environmental sustainability anymore. This is about the fact that it is just flat out more expensive to run a coal plant in the United States of America than it is to build new renewable energy projects close to where those coal plants are and get that onto the transmission system. And so everything in red is essentially already uneconomic, and everything in blue is about to be uneconomic. I would imagine that this slide is already outdated and most of those blue dots are uneconomic at this point. And that's why they're being shut down by utilities rapidly. As Klaus said, we have got a moral obligation, and I think you're going to see a lot of policy directed at this, including through something called securitization, at helping coal communities recover. We cannot just abandon coal communities like Page and the Navajo Nation, Joseph City near Cholla, St. John's near Coronado, Springerville, Eager, all of these communities, the Four Corners coal plant, all of these communities deserve our support. And the effects of shutting these coal plants down is going to be economically catastrophic. For instance, the Hopi Nation just lost 80% of its general operating budget when NGS was shut down by SRP. The Navajo Nation, just by virtue of that one coal plant shutting down, lost 25% of their entire operating budget, $50 million a year. You can imagine if any of the cities that we live in lost that kind of revenue, what would happen? And yet that deficit is not, we are not helping them yet make up that deficit. I think we absolutely have to, and states are beginning to look at that. Just wanted to mention, this is very popular. Renewable energy continues to be popular among both Democrats and Republicans. I can attest to that, having won 2 elections primarily on this issue back in the 2000s. And so I think that support really hasn't waned. I'm going to skip over that. This is a place called Pebble Creek, Arizona, where one very conservative retirement community where one out of every 3 homes is now solarized. So we are seeing support all over the place. I think the other driver from the standpoint of utilities for the development of clean energy in all states is that it's just cheaper than everything else. Utility scale solar bids are coming in below 2 cents a kW. That is unbelievable and something none of us thought would happen so precipitously. And I'm being told that my time is up, and I'll stop and I'll just say a growing number of cities are also committing to power their operations solely with renewable energy. These are some of the cities are doing that. Let me just find, these are some of the corporations that are also going 100% clean with their operations throughout the country. I want to just end with this. One of the things that I think you're going to see, as I mentioned, is the build out and the expansion of energy markets in the West. But one of the things that the Biden administration has signaled from a policy standpoint, and I think we do need to work on, is transmission. We do not have an extra high voltage transmission system that is capable of really sending those clean electrons to cities in the places where it's going to be used. All those zeros on that map that I'm showing means there's zero transmission capacity on those transmission lines that were built by the utilities decades and decades ago to basically service those coal plants that are now being shut down. So we're going to need more transmission, although some of those shutdowns will free up capacity. These represent projects that were not able to, have not basically been able to get onto the transmission system. Finally, I'll end with this. One thing to watch out for in terms of policy going forward is that resilience related to climate change, wildfires, and extreme heat is going to be a major driver for the Biden administration for policy, as is environmental justice. And I know that this group is going to talk a lot about how I think direct air capture can have the benefit of helping traditionally disadvantaged communities deal with pollution and deal with some of the effects of traditional sources of energy. So I'll end it there. Thank you all so much. What a great group we have assembled, and I know we're going to have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And now we will actually have a slight change in the agenda. Dr. John Ditinsky from the Office of Advanced Fossil Technology in the Department of Energy is here to give a few words to everyone. Dr. Ditinsky? I think you may be on mute if you are speaking.
Yep, apologize, double muted. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, very good. Thank you. And thank you for just a couple of minutes. And I just wanted to say a few words of why this project is important. I'm trying to do this at each one of the meetings throughout the Intermountain West region and the study, just because it is important for DOE to invest in activities like this and what you're trying to accomplish here. And specifically because we looked at the Intermountain West and we saw a real opportunity with the recent activities to support coal and power plant communities are going to have to undergo this transition. And if you look from Montana to Arizona and all the states in between, it is truly a significant challenge, and not just, I would say, burden, but it is a burden to make a transition for these communities that is equitable. As they move away from fossil fuels, or they make a transition to decarbonize their economies or their operations, and they move towards hydrogen, or they integrate renewable energy into those systems, it's extremely difficult. And so the administration has a number of activities, including the interagency working group on coal and power plant transmission or transitions that is supporting those communities, and many other activities. But specifically to Iwest, the benefit is really that this is a stakeholder-driven process. And I think it's important. Many people understand this, that as you start to model a system, models are typically always incorrect anyway. But the more that you can get stakeholder input, like you're doing here, to inform the decisions or the processes of those models, I think it's extremely important. Will help lead to a better result. This started out to look at a carbon economy and low carbon and how to decarbonize. It quickly became evident to us within the DOE that there's a number of activities, including hydrogen and biomass and direct air capture and other things that are going to need to be considered in the ecosystem as you look at how these economies are going to transform. And so, very excited to hear the first two talks by Klaus and others, and Klaus is a longtime colleague. And so it's good to hear, but all those systems are going to have to evolve over time together. So if you have carbon capture and storage in some regions that are developing that infrastructure, it's going to help pull along DAC and the decarbonization and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. But you need CCS for DAC. You need CCS for the industrial, and sometimes even the power sector as it transitions to a cleaner, low carbon fuel. This is not just the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. I just wanted to make sure everybody understands we've been renamed over the last year to include carbon management, and has become the emphasis of our organization. But this also includes other offices within the department. The Bioenergy Technologies Office is contributing funds to this activity, and some of the other offices are at least watching and participating in the meetings themselves, like the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Office. They may be funding some activities directly through this, the Iwest effort, or they may be funding related activities such as NREL and other national labs to look at hydrogen deployment in the region. But we want to make sure that's all coordinated. So I just want to make you aware of that internal to DOE, there's some real effort to make sure that we're coordinated through what we called some crosscuts on some of these activities. But specifically in Iwest, and just to let you know, I mean, we're very supportive of meeting the goals of the administration. 50% reduction in the decarbonization of the economy by 2030, full decarbonization of the electricity sector by 2035, full decarbonization of the entire economy by 2050. That is going to be monumental shift in investments, as well as the research and development that we fund. Very important to us on how we make those strategic investments. So the discussions that you're having here and throughout the rest of the Iwest is going to help us decide how we make those investments and what research and development, but hopefully demonstration projects that we also invest in the coming years. So again, I don't want to spend too much time. I just want to express my gratitude to everyone, Stephanie and Klaus and others, everybody coming together in Los Alamos to discuss this important issue. And again, wish you best of luck as you move this along. Anything good it has to happen with people coming together, building some coalitions, and hopefully build some better things for the region. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ditinsky, and we wish we could have done all this in person and share some food with all of you, but maybe next time. So now we will turn over to the Q&A, and we will run a little bit over the time, but I think it's important to give enough time here, so we will end around 10 or something like that. And I will first like to introduce who the panelists are. Dr. Habib Azarabadi, who is an expert in direct air capture, will be moderating this session. And along with hearing from Klaus, Chris, and myself, I would also like to introduce Dr. Michael Hanneman, who is an environmental economist. I would like to introduce Dr. Matthew Green, who is an expert in carbon capture sorbent technology. And I would like to introduce Dr. John McGowan, who is an expert on algae technology. So if you would raise your hand or type your questions into the chat, Habib will now moderate this session, and I will remove this presentation. Habib, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Please have your questions coming in the chat, and I will try to respond as many as we can. We also have a list of prepared questions based on your response to the questionnaire that we sent before the workshop. So I want to start with this first question for Klaus, and it is what volume of synthetic fuel can be produced by mechanical trees?
Well, so I needed to unmute, but the answer is you need about 10 kilograms of CO2 to make a gallon of gasoline. So if you have that 12 pack of those trees, which you can squish into a shipping container, you are talking about 1,000 kilograms, or roughly 100 gallons in the course of a day. My point earlier was the solar panels, which provide the energy, are much larger than the device which collects the CO2.
Thank you. So the next one, I think either Klaus or Michael, it says, as we move to significantly increase solar production and implement carbon reduction, what should Arizona expect to pay per kilowatt hour of electricity?
Guys, do you want me to take that, or?
Oh, yeah, please go ahead, whoever can, sorry.
Okay. Well, and we, you know, I'll say we also have another expert on the line, which is Corey Hockey, who sits on the board of directors of SRP. I think he would agree with me that if done right, actually, as I mentioned earlier, Arizona should expect to pay less per kWh. And that's because renewable energy costs are coming in far below traditional utility system costs. Now, there will obviously be costs associated with the build out of the transmission system that will have to be socialized across all ratepayers to accommodate decarbonization. But, you know, most analyses that I have seen shows that there are, you know, significant, if not in the billions of dollars of savings associated with decarbonization. That is a separate question from what it would cost to have a separate standards or requirements for direct air capture, which I think is something that we ought to be talking about. And that's something that Klaus and his team are working on in terms of really commercializing and driving down the cost of DAC, because I think it's clear we have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But let me just say, and I'll stop. This is why you do this. I mean, we set renewable energy standards across this country back in the 2000s because we believed that requiring the utilities to do it meant that you could drive down the cost. And I mean, I'll be honest, never in my wildest dreams did I think that we would accomplish that objective in 10 years, which is what we've done. But that's where we're at. We drove down the cost of renewable energy below utility system costs in a decade by requiring the utilities to build it and getting economies of scale.
Thank you. I think, Chris, the next question is for you as well. And ask, what is the plan to involve the 22 tribes in Arizona and the impact of energy transition on them? And also there's another question that talks about the communities that have been economically devastated by, for example, shutting down a coal plant in the Navajo Nation. How we can bring equity to Indian tribes in the state?
Well, I mean, there's I think a couple of answers. Number one, several states have started to examine, including Colorado and New Mexico through the New Mexico ETA, Energy Transition Act, essentially direct payments to these communities and requirements that the utilities build renewable energy as replacement sources of energy as the coal plants shut down. President of the Navajo Nation, Jonathan Nez, and ASU has been working with the nation on this, just negotiated a package with APS associated with the shutdown of the Four Corners and Cholla power plants worth more than $200 million to the Navajo Nation, and an agreement by APS to buy 600 megawatts of renewable energy from the nation. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing for each and every one of these communities, so that we give them a bridge into the future. And I'll just say, and I'm so glad that DOE is here and is sponsoring this conference, and appreciate the words that were just said about the importance of this issue. The Biden administration has made it clear that helping coal impacted communities is a top priority for them. And I do believe they are going to direct significant resources into these communities to help them bridge through the divide. But we need a process, and we need a focus in this country on this issue that's just like the BRAC process, the base realignment and closure process for military bases that we had several decades ago.
Thank you. So the next question is about nuclear. Where does in this decarbonization picture does nuclear fit, especially given the fact that it can help us with the intermittency issue of solar energy as a reliable baseload, and nuclear as a reliable baseload can help with that. Klaus, you're muted, I think.
I would argue nuclear had a fantastic chance, but right now it's far too expensive, and it's actually not very good at ramping up and down. As a matter of fact, if the local utilities have made the case that Palo Verde could actually be in danger from too much renewable energy, because they need to make roughly 2 cents a kilowatt hour on average. And if they can't run most of a good fraction of the day, that will hurt them. So I don't know where nuclear is. Before Fukushima, I was teaching classes still in New York. I was quite bullish on it, but right now the price is too high, and I think you will see the old plants run to their limit, but I have a hard time believing that we add a lot more. And it's not just safety and issues like that, but maybe because of all of those, the price has gotten so high that you cannot really compete with gas and in the future with renewable. And the challenge for renewable is its intermittency, and the ability to even that out by making hydrogen, which you can then turn into a liquid, allows you to tap into this. Of course, you have batteries if you shift loads from morning to evening, but you will use chemicals if you shift the load from summer to winter.
Thank you. So this next one is for DAC experts on the panel. Obviously, like, we do have a lot of solar electricity in Arizona, but if you want to make synthetic fuel, you would need water for electrolysis to produce sustainable hydrogen. Is that going to be a challenge in Arizona, particularly? And yeah.
Water is always a challenge. On the other hand, the amount of hydrogen tied up in gasoline is so small that compared to my household use of water, the additional use of water that ended up in the gasoline is tiny. I am more concerned about the water use of direct air capture, because that, for a variety of reasons, can be problematic. One is if you have a liquid sorbent, don't kid yourself, the liquid will evaporate, and you need to make sure that you're not losing vast amounts of water that way. And water can get in the way of the sorbents, and moisture swing explicitly relies on using it. So there it really comes down to, on the other hand, there are a variety of DAC technologies. Some consume water, some actually produce water, and you will have to adjust it for the right place in the desert. But just like we're not worried about water vapor coming out of your tailpipes, I don't think you should be worried about consuming a gallon of water for a gallon of gasoline. And I'm not sure, that's probably not even quite the right ratio, but order of magnitude is right.
Thank you. So this question, I'm going to go back to the list of questionnaire, to the questions that we got from the pre-workshop questionnaire. And this one is about algae. what sort of, for John, what sort of product can be produced from algae, and what does the market look like for those? I imagine particularly in Arizona.
Yeah, so the current, focus for most commercialization around algae is decidedly not commodity scale products. It's still too expensive from a biomass standpoint to economically drive to, say, fuels. So the bulk of the production and a lot of the commercial focus is around high value products, either food and feed, nutraceuticals, fish food replacements, as well as water remediation technologies, and then a pretty strong focus right now on biomolecules from algae for novel plastics materials, really capitalizing on that focus of being able to get to a carbon neutral molecule that you can then put into usually higher end plastics, but still trying to get through replacements for petroleum feedstocks.
Thank you. So I think the Q&A session was until 10. Do we have time, Stephanie, to continue? Because there are more questions.
Yeah, let's ask 2 or 3 more.
Okay. So this next one is for Chris. Chris, you made the point that Arizona doesn't have the available transmission capacity. What does Arizona need, and who is responsible for this decision to expand the transmission, particularly for solar and fuel production in the state?
So yeah, we don't, although it's going to be interesting to see exactly how much what's called ATC, available transmission capacity, is freed up by virtue of the closure of these coal plants. There will be significant ATC that's freed up. So obviously we want to reuse those transmission lines to the greatest extent possible. It's the responsibility of the utilities and each individual public utility commission in the first instance. That's what's kind of a little bit messed up about our system in the United States, which is, each state can veto a transmission line. I'm still in favor of state-led processes for transmission, but you do have some crazy situations like in Colorado where individual counties can veto a transmission line when utilities are trying to site it. So we need to do a better job of getting regional collaboration around the siting of extra high voltage transmission lines. And then I think there's a significant amount of help we can get from the federal government. And I'm sure the Biden administration is looking at this in terms of, loan programs, financing programs for building transmission around this renewable energy extraordinary build out that we're going to have to see. And then, of course, there's the issue of the resiliency in the West. Some of the drought that's occurring in California, Arizona, and the recent, razor thin margins that we're seeing coming out of California because of extreme heat, and the fact that they are having to call on Arizona utilities and Arizona businesses to do demand response just to keep the lights on in the West. We have to build more transmission to make sure we can ride through these extreme heat events in the summertime. And that's just absolutely critical. And I think it's something for DOE and others to focus on.
Thank you. This next one is, I believe it's Stephanie can answer this. And does ASU have an outreach to deal specifically with tribes to move under decarbonization path? And also there's another question regarding tribe, that if ASU can assist with carbon monitoring in Indian reservations.
Yeah, thanks, Habib. So I will speak first about the Iwest Initiative. I think that was a question too. There will be specific meetings with sovereign nation members. This is being organized for later in this month. So there is effort to involve the different tribes in this region. As far as ASU is concerned, we do have Jacob Moore here on the line, who is our tribal representative or tribal liaison. And we are hoping to work with tribal members who have some ideas, who have concerns, to report these ideas to Los Alamos and then to the DOE. And we encourage you to come forward and work with us. And as far as helping with monitoring carbon, I'm not quite sure, but maybe Corey Hockey, who's also on the line, and he's the sustainability officer, may have more to say on that.
Great, thank you. I think this was the last question we wanted to do. You're 8 minutes over time.
Okay, well, I thank you, everyone. I know we couldn't get through all the questions, but we will be keeping them and working to answer them in the future, and send back the answers to them. And in the meantime, it would be good if everyone—
I can make one remark to one
yes.
question. The question is, can we really see revolutionary change without a price on carbon? Maybe, but you do need a regulation on carbon. I think what you will see is that the economics of photovoltaics will drive us away from fossil fuels. But to really push it over the top, you also need to know that the climate change is so devastating that you need to deal with it. Whether that implements itself as a price or a regulation, which basically says you must not dump CO2 into the atmosphere. We don't know yet, but if we ignore that problem, people will always find a good excuse to cut corners. So we will have to have some rules along those lines, and that's part of the societal compact which has to be forged in all of this. And it's a little bit like sewage in the past, right? At some point, a little bit of slop in the street didn't hurt anybody. And then we figured out it's dangerous and harmful. And we put rules up about how sewage and garbage is treated.
Thank you, Klaus, for those remarks. So we will now take a 5-minute break. I encourage you to stretch and come back at 10:15 when we will start our breakout sessions. Thank you, everyone.